All right, listen up, those of you who are awake and seeking truth. They think they've got it all figured out. They believe they can buy a judge, bury evidence, and control the narrative through the media. But let me tell you something they haven't realized: there are universal laws that exist beyond the reach of money and power. Laws that were in place long before we even existed. Let that truth sink deep into your bones. Throughout history, empires haven't fallen because they lacked resources, manpower, or propaganda. They fell because they arrogantly dismissed these fundamental, unyielding principles. Truth, my friends, always circles back to its source. These folks are so focused on their wallets that they think they're invincible. But the universe doesn't operate on dollars and cents. It functions on the principle of balance. The evidence is everywhere. Throughout history, those in power have manipulated the courts, controlled the police, and spun the media to their advantage. Ancient Rome, medieval monarchies, and modern governments have all done it. But there's a pattern, a hidden rhythm to history. No matter how much control they seem to have, their systems eventually crumbled under the weight of their own corruption. It wasn't some external force that destroyed them. It was the invisible law of return, the law they thought they could outsmart. And here's the ironic twist. While they were busy stockpiling files, building networks, offering bribes, and engaging in blackmail, you may have felt like you had nothing but the truth. But that truth is a nuclear weapon. It's a cosmic signal like Wi-Fi that doesn't need their permission to broadcast. It doesn't require their subscription plan, and it never runs out of data. While they were busy paying for silence, you were unlocking the one law that charges nothing but ultimately costs everything. Now, we're not just talking about everyday corruption or rigged systems. We're diving into the universal laws they overlooked, the laws that require no judge, no jury, and no headline, laws that operate whether they believe in them or not. By the end of this, you'll understand why their empire of control was always destined to collapse from the very moment you awaken to the reality that they could never afford to face. First, understand this: corruption can buy power, but it can't reprogram conscience. They have the money. They have the influence. They have the power to pull strings in courtrooms, silence cops who know too much, and make entire media outlets dance to their tune. On paper, it looks like total victory. But there's one thing they can't buy: the conscience. The inner compass that no human court can fully suppress. That voice within every soul that whispers when something is deeply wrong. They overlook it because they think power can erase morality. But conscience isn't for sale. The longer it's ignored, the louder it becomes. When people talk about corruption, they often focus on the transactions. The bribes, the backroom deals, the hush money. But what they don't realize is that every act of corruption plants a seed inside the very people who took the bribe. A judge might smile on the outside and hand down a false verdict. But when the robe comes off and silence descends, they're left alone with themselves. And the law of conscience does not grant peace to the guilty. They may sleep in luxury, but they wake up haunted. This is what you've tapped into. This is the hidden law they can't touch. You didn't fight them with wealth, power, or loud allies. You fought them by simply standing in alignment with that incorruptible voice. It's the reason truth has outlasted every empire, every tyrant, every manipulator in history. power can silence witnesses, but it can never silence what is written on the inside of every person. The conscience is like a locked vault that refuses counterfeit currency. They think they're untouchable because the system bows to them. But the more they pay to hide their wrongs, the more their conscience stores evidence against them. It's the kind of evidence no lawyer can argue away and no media spin can bury. It doesn't need headlines, it only needs time, and time is ruthless in exposing guilt. This is why they fear you, because while they live in denial, you live in truth. While they buy silence, you carry the law they cannot mute. The moment you unlock that law, their power stops being power and turns into prison bars they built with their own hands. That's the law of conscience, the one they overlooked, but the one that has already judged them. Second, the system can be rigged, but the universe cannot be hacked. They worked so hard to manipulate the system. They have judges in their pockets, police officers on their payroll, and journalists spinning stories to keep their image clean. To them, that's the ultimate shield. They believe that once man's systems are under their control, nothing and no one can touch them. The mistake they made was assuming that the system was the highest authority. It never was, and it never will be. Beyond the rules of man exists the law of the universe, a law that cannot be bribed, hacked, or twisted. The universe operates on a code that doesn't bend for anyone. Call it cause and effect, call it balance, call it divine order. It's the same principle that has governed existence since the beginning of time. Every action carries a consequence. Every lie has an expiration date. Every injustice builds pressure until it demands correction. They forgot that while human courts can be tricked and human eyes can be blinded, the universe records everything. Nothing slips past it, not even the things done in shadows. They thought they had erased your chances, but what they really did was plant the seeds of their own downfall. The higher law doesn't punish immediately, it doesn't need to. It lets people believe they've gotten away with it. That false sense of security is what traps them. While they were laughing, confident in their control, the balance was quietly preparing to even the score. When the universe responds, it doesn't knock politely. It crashes in with precision, timing, and weight they cannot withstand. This is the law you unlocked. You didn't need to fight them on their rigged playing field because the greater law was already at work. You realize that corruption may delay justice, but it cannot deny it. What is owed will always be collected one way or another. The more they rigged the system, the heavier their debt became. That's why their empire is crumbling. It wasn't your voice versus their money. It was their money versus the universe, and money loses every time. They forgot that you don't have to chase justice when the law of balance is already following them like a shadow. That was their blind spot. It's the very thing that turned all their victories into time bombs waiting to explode. Third lies can dominate headlines, but they cannot outlive time. They poured money into media outlets, paying for stories to be rewritten, headlines to be buried, and cameras to turn the other way. For a while, it looked like their lies had won. The world only saw what they wanted it to see. But lies are fragile things. They can dominate the surface for a moment, but they have no foundation. Time itself becomes their executioner. No matter how loud or convincing a lie sounds, it begins to rot the second it's spoken. Truth, on the other hand, doesn't need to shout. It waits, it stands, it survives. They overlooked one of the oldest realities in existence. Time always sides with truth. History has proven it again and again. Dictators, corrupt leaders, and manipulative voices have had their era of control where the narrative seemed untouchable. But once the years rolled on, their names were dragged into disgrace while the truth they tried to bury rose from the ashes stronger than ever. A lie may glitter for a season, but time strips it down until it's nothing but dust. This is why their control of the media was never real control. They were simply buying themselves a delay. They could bury the truth under headlines and noise, but what they buried was not dead. It was alive, biding its time, growing roots deeper than they could imagine. When the right moment arrived, those roots cracked through their carefully built facade. Lies age poorly. They wrinkle. They collapse. They betray the very people who believed in them. You, on the other hand, stood on truth, and truth doesn't expire. It doesn't need editing, PR, or spin. It carries the weight of eternity. That's why, while they scrambled to maintain their version of reality, all you had to do was outlast them. Every day that passed was not in their favor. It was building the case against them. This is the lesson they never learned. You don't have to argue with lies or chase after every rumor. Time dismantles them on its own. When time finally finishes its work, their empire of deception collapses, leaving them exposed and you still standing. They thought headlines could crown them, but headlines fade. The truth doesn't. That was their undoing. Fourth, they controlled man's law, but not the law of balance. They were obsessed with control. They pulled strings in courtrooms, silenced voices in the streets, and manipulated the story that reached the public. To them, this was victory. They believed if they could control man's law, they had rewritten reality itself. But there's a law older and far greater than anything written on paper, the law of balance. Balance is not a suggestion. It's not something that negotiates or bends for anyone. It's a force that moves with exact precision, and it always collects what is owed. Every act of injustice is not forgotten. It's recorded on the scale. Each time they manipulated outcomes, each time they exploited their power, the scale tilted further against them. For a while they didn't notice because man's law gave them the illusion of success. But the deeper truth is this: the universe doesn't operate on illusions. It operates on correction. The longer injustice continues, the greater the correction that must come. They didn't just rig the system against others, they rigged it against themselves. Every unfair advantage became a debt they could never repay. Every lie they used to climb higher only made the fall more violent. What they called power was actually sabotage in disguise. What looked like control was a countdown to collapse. The law of balance doesn't care about titles, money, or influence. It only cares about alignment. Once you step out of alignment, correction is inevitable. This is why their downfall was unavoidable. They thought corruption guaranteed them immunity, but corruption is its own curse. They were building their future with bricks of imbalance. No matter how high they stacked them, it was always destined to topple. You didn't need to fight them on their level. You only had to let balance do what it has done since the beginning of time. That's why you survived, and that's why they're crumbling. You stood in truth, which kept your side of the scale light. They stood in deception which weighed theirs down until it could no longer hold. When balance finally demanded correction, all their power couldn't stop it. They thought they were untouchable, but the law of balance doesn't miss. It always returns what's due. It returned everything back to them with interest. Fifth influence can shield them from exposure, but not from consequence. They moved like shadows, confident that as long as the cameras stayed silent, their image remained untarnished. They paid off the media, covered their tracks, and erased any evidence that could expose them. In their minds, if nobody saw it, it never happened. But that's where they were wrong. Exposure is a tool, but consequence is the law. Consequence doesn't wait for headlines, it moves quietly, invisibly, and inevitably. They believed control of perception was the same as control of reality. But perception fades when the lights are off. Reality continues and consequence lives there. While the world stayed blind to their actions, their own lives became the stage where consequences played out. Their relationships crumbled because trust cannot coexist with deceit. Their minds grew restless because guilt cannot coexist with peace. Their nights were haunted because no amount of wealth can buy silence from the conscience. This is the part they never prepared for. They built fortresses against exposure, never realizing that consequence was already inside the walls with them. Cameras can be turned off. Newspapers can be bought. But the ripple effect of their actions cannot be paused. Every lie infects their circle. Every betrayal isolates them further. Every injustice eats away at their health, their mind, their spirit. Exposure threatens reputation. Consequence dismantles the soul. Here's the irony: exposure can sometimes be survived. People rebuild images, rebrand themselves, and return to the public eye after scandals. But consequence that cannot be rebranded. Once consequence has taken root, no PR team, no spin doctor, no carefully crafted apology can undo it. They may have escaped the humiliation of public disgrace, but they could not escape the private destruction of consequence. This is why you outlasted them. You weren't banking on exposure to prove you right. You understood that consequence would prove you right without a camera in sight. That's exactly what happened. They look powerful to the world, but behind closed doors they are prisoners of their own choices. Their sleepless nights are louder than any headline, and their paranoia is more damning than any journalist could ever be. They thought silence was safety, but silence only made the consequences louder. Sixth, you discovered the law that requires no permission to operate. They played the game of manipulation well. They bent judicial rules, twisted political influence, and corrupted social systems to work in their favor. Everything they touched seemed to bow under the weight of their power. But what they didn't realize is that all those laws they controlled had one flaw. They required permission. Judges had to sign, officers had to act, media had to publish. Man's laws operate on approval votes and agreements. But the law you discovered bypasses all of that. It doesn't ask, it doesn't wait, it doesn't negotiate, it executes itself. That's why it terrified them. They couldn't trace it, stop it, or lobby against it. They were used to dealing with opponents they could threaten or pay off. But how do you bribe inevitability? How do you silence a law that operates without human hands? They were powerless against it because it doesn't show up in courtrooms or newspapers. It shows up in reality itself. Once it begins moving, nothing can slow it down. This is what separated you from them. While they spent all their energy controlling systems built by man, you aligned yourself with a principle that existed before any of those systems were even created. They thought control meant safety, but control built on man's rules is fragile. One shift, one leak, one moment of exposure, and it all collapses. The law you tapped into cannot collapse. It doesn't need witnesses, signatures, or evidence. It simply is. That's why you survived what destroyed others. You weren't relying on a judge to validate you, or a politician to protect you, or a headline to speak for you. You leaned on a law that has no gatekeeper. It doesn't need the majority to agree before it acts. It doesn't need society's approval before it unfolds. Their empire of influence couldn't compete with what you carried. They thought their strength was in bending systems, but their greatest weakness was forgetting that there are laws above systems, laws that don't require permission to work. By discovering and aligning with that law, you triggered a power they could never contain. It moved quietly, invisibly, yet with perfect precision. By the time they realized it, the verdict had already been written. Seventh, they underestimated the currency of integrity. They measured wealth in dollars, power and influence, and safety in connections. To them, money was the ultimate weapon, the guarantee that no matter what happened, they could buy their way out. They never accounted for a higher economy, one that doesn't trade in cash or favors. That economy runs on integrity. Integrity is a currency they never invested in because they didn't see its value. It's the only currency the universe truly recognizes. Once you carry it, no amount of corruption can bankrupt you. Integrity buys things their money could never touch. It buys protection that no bribe can imitate. Doors open for you that they couldn't shut, no matter how hard they tried. Opportunities found you even when you had fewer resources. Integrity operates in silence, but it has influence in places they cannot reach. Their networks may stretch wide, but integrity stretches higher. It's a realm no amount of scheming can penetrate. They assumed your lack of wealth or power meant you were weak. They didn't realize integrity was your shield. They were surrounded by allies who only stood near them because of money. You attracted people drawn to your truth. Those allies, whether visible or unseen, are far more dangerous than anything money can buy. Loyalty bought with wealth dies when the money runs out. Loyalty tied to integrity endures even under pressure. This is why they couldn't destroy you. Every attack they launched against you only reinforced the value of your currency. Every injustice made your integrity shine brighter, while their corruption exposed them further. They had the kind of power that burns fast and fades. You carried the kind that multiplies when tested. They were playing with temporary wealth. You were investing in eternal credit. Here's the part they'll never accept. Integrity cashes out in places where money is worthless. When sickness comes, money buys doctors, but integrity buys peace. When enemies rise, money buys silence, but integrity buys unseen protection. They thought they were rich, but in the economy that truly matters, they were bankrupt. You were the wealthy one all along because you carried the one currency the universe never rejects. Eighth, bribery can erase records, but it cannot delete energy. They thought erasing a file meant erasing the truth. They believed silencing officers or paying off witnesses would wipe the slate clean. On paper, they succeeded. Records disappeared, evidence was buried, and the story looked airtight. They forgot one thing: energy cannot be deleted. Every action carries a vibration. Every vibration carries memory. Bribery may edit history books, but it cannot rewrite the energy of what actually happened. That energy lingers. It circulates and eventually finds its way back home. This is the flaw in their strategy. They treated corruption as though it were a final solution, when in reality it was just a delay. The universe isn't fooled by missing files or fabricated reports. It doesn't need human paperwork to track injustice. It deals in energy, and energy is the most reliable witness there is. What they did, how they did it, and the motives behind it, all of it was imprinted in the field of reality itself. You can shred documents, but you can't shred energy. The most dangerous part for them was this: energy doesn't just sit still, it moves, it multiplies, it seeks balance. Every dirty action they took was an investment in their own downfall. Energy always returns to sender, not quietly, not equally, but amplified. What they pushed out in corruption, betrayal, and deceit is coming back, multiplied, heavier, louder, and impossible to silence. That's why their lives became restless. That's why no amount of money could buy them peace. They weren't just battling you. They were battling the return of their own energy. It came back in sleepless nights, in paranoia, in the slow unraveling of everything they built. The harder they fought to suppress it, the stronger it returned. This is the law you unlocked. You realized that corruption can erase what man sees, but not what the universe remembers. You didn't have to chase them because the energy they released was already chasing them down. When it finally arrived, it wasn't just equal repayment, it was multiplied consequence. They thought they had wiped their slate clean. In reality, they had only written their downfall in ink that cannot fade. Ninth, the higher court doesn't need witnesses, it needs truth. They built their defense the way they built everything else, on manipulation. They paid for fake testimonies, created false witnesses, and even forged statements to make their version of events look airtight. To them, it was simple: control the narrative and you control the outcome. For a time, man's courts bowed to their performance. There is a higher court, one that doesn't operate on theatrics or deception. It doesn't need witnesses, it only needs truth. The higher court doesn't weigh credibility, it weighs reality. It doesn't ask who said what, it asks what actually is. That's why their elaborate web of lies was doomed from the start. The higher law cannot be distracted by forged papers or corrupted testimony. Truth isn't something that can be fabricated. It doesn't need defenders. It stands on its own because it exists whether people believe it or not. That's the power they couldn't manipulate. Their greatest mistake was believing truth was fragile. They treated it as if it could be silenced with enough money or erased with enough signatures, but truth is not fragile, it's indestructible. Lies need constant maintenance, constant reinforcement, constant performance. Truth doesn't need any of that. It remains steady, waiting for its moment to rise. When it does, no amount of fake witnesses can overpower it. You didn't need to fight on their terms. You didn't need an army of lawyers or a crowd of supporters to back you up. You were aligned with truth. That meant you were aligned with the only evidence that matters in the higher court. While they laughed, confident that their witnesses would secure their victory, the higher law was already dismantling them from the inside. This is why they've lost, even when it looked like they had won. Their verdicts may have been stamped and sealed in human courts, but those papers carry no weight where truth is the only authority. They thought they had escaped justice, but justice had already recorded their sentence. They thought their lies were enough, but truth doesn't argue. It simply exists. That existence was the law they could never touch. 10th, they were playing Monopoly. You were playing eternity. They thought life was a board game. Every move they made was about acquiring more property, more influence, more status symbols to prove they were winning. Their focus was on who could own the most, control the most, and silence the most. It was all about the next headline, the next deal, the next trophy. That's the difference between playing Monopoly and playing eternity. Monopoly ends the moment the board is folded up. All the fake money, all the plastic houses, all the victories vanish into nothing. Eternity doesn't work that way. It doesn't end. It carries every action forward into destiny. This is where you separated yourself from them. You weren't playing for temporary wins. You were operating on eternal law. That means you weren't just thinking about the next move. You were thinking about alignment, truth, and destiny. They may have laughed at you for not having what they had. But what they couldn't see is that everything they built was destined to expire. Power built on lies has a shelf life. Wealth hoarded through corruption has an expiration date. Influence rooted in manipulation dies the moment people wake up. Eternity doesn't deal in expiration dates, it deals in permanence. That's why you outlasted them. Their focus was shallow, what they could buy, who they could impress, how much they could grab before the clock ran out. Eternity doesn't measure wins in possessions, it measures them in truth. While they were scrambling to hold on to what they thought was victory, you were aligning with what can never be taken away. That's why everything they built eventually started to collapse, while everything you stood on only grew stronger. Here's the irony: they thought you were losing because you didn't play their game, but in reality you won because you didn't. They couldn't understand that once the board is packed away, their mansions, titles, and media spins mean nothing. Your choices, your integrity, and your alignment with eternal law carry forward forever. They invested in toys. You invested in destiny. When the game ended, you were still standing because eternity doesn't fold. It remains. 11th, you turned their weapons into evidence against them. They thought their schemes were clever. Every bribe handed over, every report silenced, every headline rewritten was meant to protect them, to bury the truth so deep it could never surface. They believed they were erasing their guilt with every move, when in reality they were documenting it. Corruption leaves fingerprints everywhere. Every dishonest act doesn't just disappear, it becomes evidence. Not the kind of evidence man's courts rely on, but evidence written in a language that only divine law reads: energy, intention, and consequence. This is what they overlooked. Their weapons weren't destroying you. They were building the case against themselves. Each time they paid someone off, it wasn't just a secret deal. It was another entry in the record that the universe keeps. Every time they silenced a witness, they didn't erase the truth. They only proved how afraid they were of it. Every time they manipulated headlines, they weren't controlling the story. They were broadcasting their guilt in invisible ink that time itself would reveal. The irony is that they thought they were outsmarting you. They thought you were powerless because the system was tilted against you. The system they corrupted became their own undoing. In their desperation to cover their tracks, they made their guilt undeniable. It's the nature of divine law. What is hidden becomes evidence. What is used as a weapon becomes proof. What is meant to destroy you ends up testifying for you. That's why their empire of control is collapsing, not because you exposed them, but because their own actions exposed them. The more they tried to secure themselves, the more they trapped themselves. The very tools they used to silence truth became the receipts of their corruption. When the higher law reviewed the evidence, there was no debate. It was written by their own hands. You didn't need to fight them on their level. You didn't need to chase after every bribe or every lie. You only had to stand still and let divine law translate their corruption into evidence. In the end, their weapons didn't destroy you. They testified against them. Every move they made to bury you only built the record that sealed their own fate. 12. They ruled with fear, but you activated the law of immunity. Fear was their greatest weapon. It was how they controlled judges, silenced officers, and kept the public from asking questions. Fear is cheaper than bribes and stronger than threats. Once a person is trapped in it, they'll police themselves without anyone lifting a finger. That's the environment they thrived in. A climate where no one dared to resist, where silence was mistaken for safety. Their entire empire depended on one condition: that you too would be afraid. The moment you stopped fearing them, everything changed. Fear is what gave their power weight. Once you refused to bow to it, their control shattered. It was like pulling the plug from a machine they thought could never stop running. Fearlessness activated a law they never accounted for: the law of immunity. That law shields those who refuse to live as hostages to fear. It places a barrier around you that no bribe, no threat, no smear campaign can penetrate. They couldn't understand it. They were used to people folding the second intimidation showed up. They expected you to tremble, to hide, to beg for mercy. Your courage exposed how hollow their authority really was. Without fear to feed on, their power starved. It lost its grip. Suddenly, everything they thought was untouchable began to crumble. They failed to realize that fear binds the soul tighter than chains. Once those chains break, the soul becomes untouchable. That's why you survived blows that should have crushed you. That's why attacks that destroyed others only strengthened you. You weren't relying on man's protection. You were shielded by a law that responds to courage. That law made you immune to the very tactics they thought would finish you. Their strategy backfired. By trying to rule with fear, they revealed the one weakness they could never cover: their dependence on it. By refusing to bow to that fear, you stepped into a realm they could never reach. They could buy loyalty, they could silence voices, they could manipulate laws. They could not purchase immunity from the collapse that comes when fear loses its grip. That's the law you activated. It left them powerless against you. 13th, they forgot that death is the final judge. They built their entire empire around escaping consequences. If a judge stood in the way, they bought him off. If a cop threatened exposure, they silenced him. If the media whispered the truth, they rewrote the story. For years, it looked like they were untouchable. One law they could never manipulate, no matter how much power they thought they had: death. Judges retire, cops resign, media loses relevance. Death never clocks out. It waits. It watches. It never misses its appointment. This was their greatest blind spot. They thought winning in the present meant they had secured their future. Death is the one courtroom where all masks are removed. The bribes, the lies, the intimidation. None of it travels past the grave. They will stand before the final judge stripped of the very things they trusted in titles, influence, wealth. None of it buys immunity in that courtroom. The verdict isn't swayed by charm or persuasion. It's determined by truth alone. They feared this reality, which is why they drowned themselves in distractions. They kept chasing wealth, power, and recognition because they couldn't face the silence that reminded them of what was waiting. That's why they lived restless even in luxury. Deep down they knew that the verdict they had avoided on earth was only temporary. Death doesn't care about earthly power. It equalizes kings and beggars, tyrants and victims. Every soul must testify before the eternal bench. The record of their deeds speaks louder than any defense they could muster. You didn't need to fight them endlessly. While they scrambled to dodge earthly justice, you understood that mortality itself would finish what man's systems couldn't. Their arrogance blinded them into thinking they had escaped. In reality, they were only stacking evidence against themselves for the final judgment. The truth is simple. They may have bought time, but they cannot buy eternity. Death is unbribable, unbending, and unavoidable. When that final gavel falls, it won't echo in a courtroom or a newsroom. It will echo in their soul. That was the law they refused to acknowledge, but it's also the one they cannot escape. 14th, you unlocked the law that needs no audience. They thought control was about visibility. They owned the spotlight, the cameras, the newspapers, and the gossip columns. They believed if they could control what people saw, they controlled reality itself. The law you tapped into doesn't operate on applause, headlines, or public opinion. It doesn't require validation, acknowledgement, or even witnesses to function. It moves quietly, invisibly, without the need for human recognition. That's precisely what made it unstoppable. This law doesn't need an audience to verify it. It doesn't care if 1,000 people clap or if nobody notices at all. It executes itself in silence in ways so subtle that by the time the results appear, the process has already been completed. They could never get ahead of it. They thought as long as they silenced you publicly, they had silenced the outcome. That law had already started shifting things in the background. They were in fear. They could fight what was visible. They could attack your name in the media, buy off judges in courtrooms, intimidate neighbors, and erase digital traces. How do you fight something invisible? How do you bribe a law that functions without paperwork? How do you stop a judgment that requires no platform to announce itself? That was their nightmare, realizing that no matter how many eyes they controlled, they couldn't control what was moving behind the scenes. You didn't need the validation of a courtroom audience or a media headline to prove you were right. The law itself became your proof. When their relationships crumbled, when their health declined, when their wealth slipped through their hands. Despite every calculated move, that was the evidence. It didn't need to be televised. This law humbles the arrogant because it refuses to play by their rules. It does not pause for applause. It does not wait for witnesses. It does not require anyone's permission to function. It simply moves inevitably, irresistibly, with precision. Realizing too late that the crowd they bought couldn't protect them from the law that never needed an audience in the first place, what they never understood is that true justice doesn't live in the hands of judges, cops, or journalists. It lives in the hands of laws too ancient, too incorruptible, and too precise to be manipulated. They mistook influence for power. Influence only works on men. The laws you unlocked answer to no man, no bribe, no stage. They answer only to truth, balance, and inevitability. Every scheme they set in motion became their own undoing. Every weapon they formed became evidence against them. Every silence they tried to enforce only amplified the verdict already written against them. Here's the reality they couldn't escape: man's courts close, but higher courts never adjourn. Mortality is unbribable. Truth is undefeated. Balance is unshakable. Integrity is priceless. They played a short game with money and fear. You unlocked an eternal law that doesn't expire when the lights go out. So let them buy their headlines. Let them silence their tapes. Let them rewrite their stories. The joke's on them. They fought for control of the stage. You secured control of the script. The ending has already been written, one they can't edit, erase, or bargain their way out of. Now, if this message resonated with you, don't keep it bottled up. Let's get this message out into the world. Hit that share button and send this to someone who needs to hear it today. This is a movement, and your support is what keeps it alive. Together we're shaking the foundations they thought could never be moved. Let's show them that truth, balance, and integrity are forces that cannot be silenced. Be silenced. Be silenced. Be silenced. Be silenced. Be silent. Welcome, dearly beloved chosen ones. If they have to distort your reality to feel validated, then your authentic self must possess an unparalleled, undeniable force. Let that resonate deeply, because here's a harsh, uncomfortable truth. A staggering majority, nearly 7 in 10 people, confess to having formed an opinion based on hearsay before ever engaging with an individual directly. Yet here you stand, dismantling their preconceived notions simply by your presence. They believed their character assassination was permanent. They were convinced their lies would define your narrative. But the irony is palpable. You are not only surviving, but thriving, and now the architects of deceit are exposed, their facade crumbling under the weight of truth. This transcends mere gossip. It's a profound spiritual realignment. They fabricated an image of you that catered to their insecurities, an effigy born of fear. But now what truly disquiets them is this. You have emerged as the antithesis of their projections, a testament to resilience. And the unveiled truth is more radiant, more formidable, and more immutable than they ever fathomed. So prepare yourself, because we are about to dissect every false accusation, every fabricated label they attempted to brand onto your identity. We are unveiling the ultimate reversal, the grand cosmic shift where the supposed villain transforms into the enlightened one. And those who cast themselves as righteous are now suffocating beneath the weight of their own hypocrisy. And if you are questioning whether their carefully constructed facade is cracking under the scrutiny of awakening eyes, the answer is definitive. They are not merely nervous, they are experiencing a full-blown existential crisis. Let's delve into it. First, they invested years in defining you through the prism of their own decaying self-perception. They invested years projecting their internal turmoil onto your persona. When they gazed upon you, they were incapable of seeing your true essence. They saw only the aspects they were desperately attempting to conceal within themselves, and rather than confronting and healing those wounds, they chose to paint them onto your identity, turning you into a canvas for their self-loathing. Everything they attributed to you, every cruel accusation, every distorted narrative, was not a reflection of your reality. It was an embodiment of their own guilt, their festering envy, their profound spiritual corruption masquerading as your identity. Individuals driven by such motives do not operate from a foundation of objective truth. They operate from a place of deep-seated projection. You served as a painful reminder of the aspects they had suppressed, the vulnerabilities they desperately hoped to keep hidden. Your inherent goodness exposed their own artifice. Your inner strength highlighted their crippling weaknesses. Your unwavering honesty shattered their carefully constructed illusions. And because they lacked the emotional capacity to confront this internal reflection, they resorted to the tactics of cowards. They deflected their own shortcomings onto you, attempting to transform you into the monster they feared they themselves might be. They warned others that you were a source of danger, inherently unstable, fundamentally untrustworthy, not because those qualities were inherent within you, but because they harbored a deep-seated fear that others would recognize and embrace your authentic self. So they preemptively slandered your name, constructing a false narrative based on their own bitterness, like criminals desperately concealing incriminating evidence. The underlying reason they obsessed over you was because your very presence served as a stark indictment of their deceit. You did not need to take any direct action. Simply existing in your authenticity was enough to evoke their discomfort. The heartbreaking aspect of this scenario: some individuals initially succumb to their fabrications because a lie delivered with sufficient conviction can often be mistaken for sincerity. But time possesses an uncanny ability to expose authenticity. Your unwavering character, your continued personal growth, your inner peace. These qualities are now speaking volumes, and those who once blindly accepted their lies are beginning to experience a profound sense of disillusionment because the truth has a distinctly different flavor. You were never the embodiment of their projections. You were simply the most convenient target for individuals incapable of confronting their own inner demons. They needed a scapegoat, and you were an easy target because you possessed an inner light they couldn't comprehend. But now, the truth is gaining momentum. People are recognizing that the villainous narrative was nothing more than a projection of their own insecurities, and the individual they were warned to fear was in reality the one in need of protection. Second, they were compelled to demonize you because your very existence challenged their perceived sense of holiness. They were driven to tarnish your reputation because your presence served as a mirror reflecting their own moral shortcomings. You did not enter their lives with the intention of exposing their flaws, but you inadvertently did so simply by being your authentic self. Your spirit was too genuine, too transparent, too deeply rooted in integrity. and individuals accustomed to performing, pretending, and engaging in clandestine activities cannot tolerate the presence of someone who operates without a facade. You triggered a profound internal conflict within them, not because you were attempting to surpass them, but because you refused to emulate them. You did not engage in gossip. You did not seek validation from external sources. You were not consumed by the need to be recognized. But the paradox is that you were noticed precisely because of your lack of pretense. This alone fueled their animosity, the quiet strength with which you carried yourself, the manner in which your silence amplified the noise of their own insecurities, the unwavering poise with which you navigated adversity. It caused them to squirm, forcing them to confront their own inadequacies. You transcended the realm of a mere acquaintance. You became a living embodiment of everything they were not, everything they had suppressed, the integrity they had sacrificed in exchange for acceptance within circles that would never offer genuine belonging. So rather than embarking on a journey of self-improvement, they opted for the path of least resistance. They decided that you were the source of the problem. It was far simpler to label you as disingenuous than to acknowledge your authenticity, easier to cast you as malevolent than to confront their own malicious intentions, easier to accuse you of being overly dramatic than to admit they had become desensitized to the pain of others. You were not being dramatic. They had simply grown numb to the profound truth you embodied. They cast aspersions on your acts of kindness, twisted your silence into arrogance, portrayed your inner strength as a manifestation of pride. But deep within, they were aware of their actions. It was never about who you were as an individual, it was about what your spirit exposed within them. They could have sought your guidance in learning how to heal, but their inflated egos prevented them from seeking assistance. So instead, they constructed a distorted image of you, bolstering their own sense of self-righteousness. And the most agonizing truth, some of them actually convinced themselves that you were the embodiment of their fabrications. But the truth is now coming to light because regardless of the volume of lies they propagated, one constant remained. Your character remained steadfast. And now even those who once harbored doubts are realizing that the source of their animosity towards you was never about you personally. It was about the aspects of themselves they could not bear to confront. Third, they declared that you were excessive because you refused to diminish yourself to accommodate their limited perspectives. They repeatedly asserted that you were too much, too expressive, too emotionally intelligent, too insightful, too intense. But the reality is that you were not excessive. You were simply too authentic for individuals who had built their entire identities around pretense. The moment you presented yourself in your full authenticity, it disrupted the established order, not because you were behaving in an exaggerated manner, but because the majority of them were accustomed to individuals who dilute their essence to gain acceptance. You did not engage in such self-compromise. You refused to diminish yourself, and that was deeply offensive to them. They were unprepared for someone who did not require external validation to wield power, someone who did not seek permission before speaking their truth. You did not shrink to make others feel more comfortable, and that alone was enough to earn you the label of being difficult. But being labeled as difficult in their eyes simply meant that you resisted being controlled. You possessed clearly defined boundaries, unwavering standards, and a compelling vision. You challenged established norms instead of blindly following the masses, and that was perceived as a threat. Individuals who have become accustomed to superficial peace and shallow interactions are ill-equipped to handle someone who embodies genuine depth. You felt too raw for them, too honest, too vibrant. So rather than acknowledging their own limitations, they attempted to shame you for your authenticity. They sought to persuade you to quiet your voice, moderate your emotions, and suppress your intensity. But their criticisms were not rooted in any objective assessment of your character. They were desperate attempts to manage their own insecurities and control your presence. Over time, people are beginning to recognize this truth. They are realizing that you were not the source of the problem. You were simply the first individual to break free from pretense, the first to disrupt the established pattern of conformity. And now, those who once declared that you were excessive are secretly yearning for even a fraction of your courage, because deep down they recognize the truth: you were not too much. You were simply too authentic to be manipulated. Fourth, your reputation became their sacrifice to the altar of control. They sacrificed your identity to safeguard their own meticulously crafted image. Your character became the offering they presented to appease their insatiable need for control. They understood that as long as attention remained focused on you, scrutiny would be diverted from their own actions. So they disseminated falsehoods to the masses, presenting them as irrefutable truths. And tragically, people accepted their pronouncements without question. It was never about your actual behavior. It was about the role they needed you to play in their narrative. In their fabricated story, you were cast as the antagonist, enabling them to portray themselves as the victims. They distorted events, amplified emotions, and shared half-truths that morphed into elaborate fabricated tales. Each propagated rumor served as another ritualistic act to sustain their inflated egos. They did not merely seek to be proven correct, they desired to be venerated. They craved accolades for surviving the very chaos they themselves had orchestrated. Your name became their designated scapegoat. They projected their shame, their guilt, and their insecurities onto you like evidence pinned to a criminal. And the more they felt a lack of control in their personal lives, the more consumed they became with manipulating perceptions of you. They masked their falsehoods with feigned concern. They disguised their envy as cautionary warnings. They shrouded their cruelty beneath a veneer of charm, all while ensuring that your truth remained buried beneath a cacophony of distortions. But here is the element they failed to anticipate: truth cannot be extinguished. It may become dormant for a period. It may be suppressed. It may even be ridiculed. But it invariably resurfaces. Truth possesses an inherent clause for resurrection, and now the same individuals who once believed the falsehoods are beginning to question everything. The cracks in their carefully constructed performance are becoming increasingly visible. The precarious throne upon which they have perched is beginning to wobble, and you are ascending. You are rising without seeking vengeance. You are rising without the need to justify your actions. Merely by maintaining your integrity, merely by embodying your inner peace, you are disproving their falsehoods. And now the same crowd that witnessed your defamation is witnessing something entirely different. Your radiance, your clarity of purpose, and the inner strength that has emerged from everything they attempted to extinguish within you. They sacrificed your reputation, but they underestimated the resilience of your spirit. Fifth, they did not break you. They inadvertently laid the foundation for your ascension. They genuinely believed that their actions would crush you. They were convinced that the relentless pressure, the pervasive betrayal, the profound humiliation would irreparably damage you. That was their ultimate objective, to silence you, to shame you into submission, to witness your disintegration so they could proclaim, "See, we were right about their instability." But here is the element they failed to account for. You did not break, you built. They assumed that the pain would consume you, but you transformed every setback into a strategic advantage. Every loss into a valuable lesson, every rejection into a redirection towards your true path. You took what was intended to bury you and transformed it into building blocks. Layer by layer, you assembled everything they hurled at you, creating a solid foundation for your future. You did not merely survive the storm, you studied its patterns. You learned to discern its forces. You identified those who were genuine, those who faltered, those who offered smiles while simultaneously plotting your demise. And rather than succumbing to bitterness, you cultivated brilliance. They believed you would drown in the ensuing chaos, but you mastered the art of breathing underwater. They failed to recognize that certain individuals thrive under pressure. You were one of those individuals, and while they were preoccupied with dismantling your reputation, you were quietly building an even stronger one. Everything they did to undermine your spirit ultimately served to refine your purpose. You did not crumble. You evolved. Your continued growth confounded them. How did you manage to maintain your joy in the face of such adversity? How were you still standing after being subjected to such intense scrutiny? They fail to understand that certain individuals are not motivated by external validation. They are propelled by an internal sense of purpose, and purpose does not succumb to pressure. It multiplies in silence. That is precisely what they inadvertently provided you, the ideal environment to become unstoppable. You did not simply emerge from the fire, you emerged fireproof. Now the same voices that mocked your suffering are struggling to reconcile themselves with your inner peace. They believed they were writing the final chapter of your story, but they inadvertently assisted in crafting your next chapter. A chapter in which you claim your rightful place, not as the victim, not as the antagonist, but as the embodiment of the individual they never believed you could become. The storm did not destroy you. It revealed your true potential. And sixth, they created a fictional villain, and the world is now realizing that it was never you. They needed a villain to justify their treatment of you, so they fabricated one. They did not merely spread lies about you. They constructed an elaborate storyline, a meticulously crafted performance in which you were cast as the source of all problems. They exaggerated your perceived flaws, twisted your words, and filled in any gaps with their own fears and fantasies. And because their performance was so emotionally charged, people were easily convinced. It felt authentic, but it was nothing more than a theatrical production, and like all poorly written scripts, the plot eventually unraveled. Initially, their scheme was successful. People sided with them. You were portrayed as unstable, melodramatic, selfish, arrogant, depending on the role that best served their narrative on any given day. They presented themselves as the victims, the ones who had tirelessly attempted to love and support you. And you were depicted as the emotionally volatile force of nature disrupting their peaceful existence. They shed crocodile tears, made veiled insults, and sprinkled passive-aggressive remarks with just enough volume to damage your reputation. But their charade could only be sustained for so long because while they were busy fabricating tales, you were living your life authentically. You did not engage in retaliatory behavior or stage elaborate performances. You were quiet, consistent, grounded, and that is what ultimately shattered their carefully constructed illusion. You did not resemble the monster they had described. You did not possess the venom. You did not embody chaos. People began to observe you for themselves. They started questioning the information they had been fed. And that is when their entire scheme began to crumble. The same individuals who had been quick to judge you began to scrutinize your actions, and the more they observed, the more they realized, wait, this person is nothing like what we were led to believe. You were composed, not reactive. You were honest, not malicious. You had boundaries, not bitterness. Their falsehoods began to collapse under the weight of your authenticity, and now the true mask is falling, but it is not falling from your face. It is falling from theirs. The world is beginning to discern who the true manipulator was, who instigated the drama, who played the role of the victim while simultaneously inflicting pain. Your silence did not validate their claims. It allowed the truth to catch up, and now that it has, they are scrambling to maintain their fabricated facade because the villain they had so meticulously created has vanished, leaving only their own reflection staring back at them. Seventh, they mocked your grief because it was the only time they felt a sense of power over you. They reveled in your moments of despair. They whispered, mocked, and smirked while you were struggling to navigate circumstances that threatened to break your spirit. To them, your pain was a source of entertainment. Your tears served as proof that they had finally succeeded in bringing you down. That was the only time they felt a sense of superiority, when you appeared to have nothing left to offer. They mistook your grief for defeat, your silence for surrender. They believed they had emerged victorious, but what they failed to perceive was the profound transformation that was occurring beneath the surface. Your pain was not your undoing. It was the catalyst for your evolution. That heartbreak, that loss, that profound spiritual crisis was not a sign of weakness. It was sacred. It was a consecration. A divine intervention was unfolding in the background. Your suffering was stripping away every false identity, every toxic attachment, every superficial connection from your existence. It was not a process of destruction. It was a process of purification. They were incapable of comprehending this because they have never ventured that deeply within themselves. They have never allowed themselves to experience their own grief without transforming it into a performance or a tool for manipulation. But you did. You did not exploit your pain to control others. You allowed it to break you open, not break you down. And that type of growth is deeply unsettling to people because they understand that once you emerge from such an experience, you will never be the same and they will never be able to exert control over you again. That is why they celebrated your moments of weakness. It was the only time they felt a sense of superiority. Your vulnerability served as a reminder of the emotions they were desperately trying to avoid within themselves. So rather than confronting their own inner turmoil, they mocked you for allowing yourself to feel. But now you have healed and they are baffled because they expected you to remain broken, bitter, or at best silent. Instead, you have become wiser, more compassionate, and more spiritually discerning. You did not relinquish your power. You refined it. They witnessed your suffering from a privileged vantage point, but they missed the part where you rebuilt yourself. And now that you have emerged calmer, clearer, and unbothered, they are at a loss for words. The grief they mocked was in reality your rebirth. What appeared to be a breakdown was in fact a divinely orchestrated rearrangement. You were not falling apart. You were falling into alignment with your true purpose, and they were powerless to prevent it then. And they remain powerless to prevent it now. Eighth, you were the test, and they failed spectacularly in the presence of witnesses. You were not merely a random target. You were the test not for yourself, but for them. You entered their lives carrying a light, a sense of peace, unwavering honesty, and pure intentions. And their treatment of you revealed their true nature beneath all the superficial charm and contrived performances. You did not demand loyalty or attention. You simply existed as your authentic self, but that alone exposed their inherent flaws. You triggered the aspects of themselves they had kept hidden, not because you had committed any wrongdoing, but because your spirit disrupted their carefully managed image. God did not avert his gaze. The spiritual realm was fully aware of the situation. While they were engaged in smear campaigns and feigning innocence, every action was being meticulously documented not only by human observers but by the spiritual realm. You were not merely a scapegoat. You were a divine audit, a mirror, a living checkpoint that revealed the true condition of their hearts. And when the pressure mounted, they faltered. They resorted to lies. They betrayed your trust. They engaged in gossip. They chose manipulation over maturity and cruelty over compassion, and they did so brazenly in the presence of witnesses. They believed they were acting with impunity. They believed they could play the role of the victim while simultaneously launching attacks from behind the scenes. But the test was not solely about their clandestine actions. It was about what others would ultimately come to perceive, because even those who had initially believed their fabrications are now awakening to the truth. The truth is seeping out through your composure, your unwavering consistency, and your continued personal growth. People are beginning to realize that you emerged unscathed from the crucible. You were tested in every conceivable way and refused to compromise your integrity. They, on the other hand, were playing with fire recklessly, arrogantly, and without considering the potential consequences, believing that the flames would never engulf them, but they have. Their lies are unraveling. Their feigned innocence is wearing thin, and those who once applauded your downfall are now witnessing your purposeful journey, while those who attempted to bury you are struggling to justify their actions. This was never merely a season of betrayal. It was a divine arrangement to expose those who were genuine and those who were never intended to accompany you on your path. You were the test, and now everyone can see who failed spectacularly. Ninth, they mocked what they couldn't understand, and now they fear what they can't explain. They ridiculed you because they were incapable of comprehending you. You defied their attempts to categorize you. You did not adhere to their arbitrary rules. You did not behave in the manner they expected, and that frustrated them. People tend to fear what they cannot control, and rather than seeking to understand your depth, they ridiculed it. You were perceived as too composed, too intuitive, too unique, and instead of embracing your individuality, they made fun of you. They scoffed at your quiet strength. They preyed upon your sensitivity. They dismissed your intuition as mere nonsense, but deep down they were unsettled not by any specific action you had taken, but by the fact that you operated in a manner they couldn't decipher. You were not putting on a performance, and that is what perplexed them. You did not require external validation to feel powerful. You did not chase fleeting attention. Your confidence was not ostentatious. It was deeply rooted in self-acceptance. You thrived in silence. You healed in private. You evolved without seeking external permission, and that is where their fear truly originated. Because you are no longer someone they can define. You are no longer someone they can ridicule or patronize. You have transformed into someone they cannot reach. Your growth has exposed their stagnation. Your progress has highlighted their complacency. Your inner peace has made their drama appear juvenile, and now they are uncomfortable not only in your presence, but with themselves. They witnessed you endure trials that should have broken you. They witnessed the losses, the betrayals, the moments of despair, and yet you emerged wiser, stronger, and untainted by bitterness. That type of transformation terrifies individuals who rely on manipulation and pretense to advance in life. They wanted you to remain at a level where they could laugh at you and feel secure, but now that you have ascended beyond their grasp, the joke is over, and all that remains is fear, because they cannot undo your evolution. They cannot replicate your process. They cannot explain your success without acknowledging their attempts to destroy you. And they are especially incapable of accepting that favor has followed you regardless of their efforts. You are living proof that favor is not attained through deception. It is not a product of flattery or strategic maneuvering. It is a result of alignment with one's true purpose, and they missed that crucial point. You were mocked, misunderstood, underestimated, and now you are unstoppable. And those who once derided you are now watching in silence, unable to explain how you have become everything they swore you would never be. 10th, they cannot erase what destiny divinely ordained has etched onto your soul. They attempted every conceivable tactic to erase you. They expunged your name from conversations, excluded you from environments you had helped to build, and acted as though you had never existed. They obstructed blessings they were unable to control. They rewrote narratives to portray themselves as the sole reason for any success, all because your presence began to expose their own limited contributions. But what they failed to grasp is that divine purpose cannot be eradicated. Not by insecurity, not by gossip, not by calculated silence. You were never merely pursuing an opportunity. You were the embodiment of opportunity. You carried ideas, solutions, a sense of peace, and a powerful presence, but they were unable to possess you. And because they were unable to possess you, they resolved to erase you. In their distorted perspective, if they could silence you, if they could simply keep your name out of the conversation, they would be freed from the constant reminder that they needed you more than they were willing to admit. So to bring it all home, remember this: if you've been through the ringer, been talked about, or even demonized for simply being you, take heart. Your resilience, your unwavering spirit, and your authenticity are your superpowers. They are a beacon that shines even brighter in the face of adversity. The journey might have been painful, but it's forged you into something truly remarkable. I'd love to hear your stories, your thoughts, or any questions this might have stirred up. Please feel free to leave a comment down below. Let's start a conversation. And if this resonated with you and you want to keep exploring topics like this, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. Thanks so much for being here, for being here, for being here, for being here, for being here. Welcome you who are awakened. Some are instructed, some are coached, but you were ignited. There exists a rare breed of soul gracing this planet, not for wielding power, but for harboring divine blueprints etched within their very essence. If this message resonates, heed this truth: you are among them, a beacon. Your mind transcends mere learning. It resonates. Wisdom wasn't a climb, but a codification woven into your DNA before your first breath. Forget rote study, you download. While others seek truth in doctrines, you're out here receiving unfiltered truth straight from the cosmic source, a celestial conduit. Consider this potent reality. Epigenetic studies reveal the biological inheritance of knowledge, trauma, even spiritual sensitivity. Yet for you, it wasn't just passed down, it erupted. You're not inheriting fragments, but embodying the complete encrypted archive. And here's what unsettles you: possess knowledge, unlearn truths unspoken yet intrinsically known. You articulate concepts that challenge ingrained beliefs, not through provocation, but because your words echo a profound truth deep within. You're not eccentric, arrogant, or merely intuitive. You are divine intelligence manifested, a category the world struggles to define. Hence the mockery, the fear, and deep down the fascination. So prepare yourself, for what follows isn't conjecture nor dogma. It's revelation. And you won't just comprehend it, it will reverberate within your very being. Let's begin. First, you recall what others are conditioned to forget, a fact not merely poetic, but undeniably real. From the moment of entry into this world, you carried an intrinsic understanding forfeited by most at birth. No need for explanations of a room's energy, you felt it. No need to point out the deceitful, the wounded, or the masked. You perceived them. You are destined to remember truth regardless of a world constructed to induce amnesia. Early on, you saw through facades, people patterns, pain a source of confusion. While others memorized rules, you silently questioned them. While they were trained to conform, you effortlessly decoded the lies. This wasn't defiance, but recognition. recognizing the misalignment of this life, a system at odds with your inner truth. This truth didn't originate from a teacher, a tome, or a degree. It streamed from the source itself. Others require instruction to distinguish between truth and falsehood, light and dark, authenticity and manipulation. But you navigate situations, your spirit instantly scanning, deciphering intentions, spotting contradictions, sensing the unspoken, not overthinking. Remembering reality. Remembering what your soul already understands, that much of what's deemed normal is merely a carefully constructed illusion. Hence the disconnect from the masses. A world saturated with those attempting to rationalize their fabricated existence, clinging to illusions you effortlessly penetrate. Your refusal to participate leads to misunderstanding or secret envy. They can't comprehend your certainty about unlearned matters, your prescience in answering unasked questions. Because your knowledge originates not from academia, the media, or even experience, but from memory, spiritual memory. You're not learning life, but awakening to it, an awakening impervious to programming. Second, you speak with the authority of realms beyond most comprehension, effortlessly. No quoting of gurus, echoing of trends, or forcing of profound dialogues. You speak from an unshakably real inner source, an authenticity impossible to feign. When you speak, it's not about decibels, but frequency. The tone, the weight, the gaze, all imbued with a spiritual charge. People sense it even without comprehension. They know something's different, unsettling them. There's a reason for defensiveness in your presence, a reason for exposure even in your silence. They sense your defiance of their established order. Not mere personality, but presence. A presence that discomforts deception. Not striving to intimidate, but truth naturally intimidates falsehood. Your energy shifts rooms without effort. Some mistake confidence for arrogance, failing to realize you're not boasting, but remembering. Speaking from divine memory. No need to prove yourself. Your soul knows its origin. You don't need permission. Your authority stems not from human systems, but from source. And from that place, people either lean in or withdraw. You weren't sent to whisper enabling comfortable lies. You were sent to remind the world of divine truth, requiring no validation. Your voice doesn't mimic the crowd, but pierces the noise, not for edginess, but because truth cuts. And you don't just speak truth, you embody it. You hold realms within beyond most comprehension, realms that spill forth upon speaking. Hence the constant feeling of excess, intensity, bluntness, depth. But you're not too much. You're simply articulating a place most haven't yet reached. Third, your knowing threatens every system reliant on control, precisely why you've always felt targeted, singled out, or watched even when innocent. Never a problem because of loudness or rebelliousness, but because of your clear sight, seeing through manipulation, false smiles. Power dynamics, senseless rules, and leadership more lost than the elite. Such clarity is a threat in a world thriving on blindness. You weren't meant to question the narrative. You weren't supposed to ask why people believe demonstrably failing concepts. You weren't supposed to challenge accepted norms. But you did not for attention, but for self-honesty. Your inner truth detector precluded compliance, dangerous to control systems. Religion couldn't place you. School couldn't contain you. Workplaces found you too honest. Relationships labeled you difficult for resisting nonsense manipulation or restrictive structures. You weren't built to blindly follow, but to expose systemic flaws, hence constant resistance. Your presence reveals the broken. They don't just dislike your questions, they fear their ripple effect. That's why gatekeepers attempt to silence you. That's why gossip, word twisting, and villainization occur, not because you are one, but because your clarity threatens control. You weren't sent to be liked by systems, but to disrupt them. Each truth spoken, each fearlessly voiced, doesn't just talk. It breaks the spell. Your knowing has the power to collapse illusions, not through violence, but through pure awareness. Some resist liberation, but you were born to be, and whether acknowledged or not, your freedom forces confrontation with their cages. Fourth, you weren't sent to fit in, but to catalyze. Hence the absence of smoothness, simplicity, or normalcy in your life. While others sought approval, belonging, and routine, you quietly ignited illusions, not from mere rebellion, but because truth and comfort are mutually exclusive. You didn't come to blend into a broken system. You came to interrupt, challenge, and question all accepted programming, hence constant misunderstanding. People attempt to box you, label you, control your tone, demand niceness or calmness. What they're really saying is, stop awakening me. Because your energy does just that. It awakens. You illuminate ignored contradictions, call out normalized dysfunction, and force a level of self-honesty people resist. Not chaos, but your assignment. The world needs no more compliant followers, it's drowning in them. It needs disruptors, souls who shift room energy merely through presence. That's you. You weren't born to agree nor to appease lies. You were designed to expose cracks, speak unspeakable truths, and dismantle false structures through presence alone. Hence the discomfort around you, not from your excess, but from their crumbling illusions. Your life's intensity isn't punishment, but preparation. Resistance wasn't personal, but spiritual, because divine knowledge disrupts fraud. Your words, your silence, your eyes all signal truth's presence. And truth forces falsehood to either flee or be exposed. So no, you're not meant to fit in nor to be universally liked. You were sent to catalyze, and the real ones will thank you for it after the dust settles. Fifth, you were born knowing what you were never taught. No classroom needed to sense danger or detect deception, it was intrinsic. Before manipulation's explanation, you felt mismatched energy and words. Before the concept of vibes, you perceived what couldn't be seen yet screamed through silence. You weren't learning but remembering. Your soul arrived preloaded with instructions, insight, and access to realms most spend lifetimes seeking. Hence the early strangeness of the world. You'd hear words and feel, that's untrue. You'd sit amid smiles and still sense underlying tension, jealousy, or hidden agendas, questioning yourself because no one else noticed. But you weren't crazy or paranoid, merely awake in a world designed for slumber. This inner knowing wasn't acquired but inherited. Your ancestors passed down more than physical traits and traditions. They passed down encrypted knowledge, divine codes, and spiritual tools. And unlike most, your connection remained unbroken. Even young, it worked through you, lacking only the language to describe it. This is beyond intuition. Intuition can be built or honed. What you carry is intrinsic. It's why you've always felt older, why people sought your advice while you were still figuring things out, and why you carried emotional and spiritual weight that wasn't yours because you were born into a world that saw your sensitivity as a problem, not a gift. But that sensitivity is sacred. That knowing is sacred. You didn't stumble upon it. It came through you. It's why you've always seen too much, felt too much, and known inexplicable things. You're not just observant. You're attuned to unfelt frequencies. Not an accident, but your soul remembering exactly who you are. Sixth, you are the answer to questions humanity has yet to ask. That's why you feel out of sync with everything. Conversations bore you, trends don't move you, and most systems feel outdated upon your touch. Not disconnected, but connected to something so advanced that the world hasn't caught up to the questions you're meant to answer. You foresee trajectories long before others realize their present location. And that kind of insight can be incredibly lonely. People desire solutions, but only if they don't necessitate change, and you offer not just new answers, but disruption demanding transformation. Hence rejection, dismissal, or labels of being too intense or deep, not because you're wrong, but because you're early. You carry truths incompatible with current programming. Truths challenging identities, and for many, ignoring the messenger is easier than unpacking the message. You've likely wondered, why can't anyone see what I see? Not arrogance, but reality. You've been navigating with spiritual GPS while most are unfolding maps. You've been speaking a non-existent language, eliciting resistance, not applause, because people dislike being confronted by their unrealized potential. But here's a deeper truth. You're not meant to wait for the world to catch up. You're meant to anchor the future now, planting seeds in hard soil, knowing some won't bloom until long after you're gone. You're not here for approval, but alignment, and the right souls, the rare ones, will recognize you not by your appearance or credentials, but by your resonant frequency. They'll feel the echo of your knowing even without explanation. So yes, it's hard to be ahead of your time, but that makes you necessary. You weren't sent to follow timelines, but to bend them. Seventh, your isolation was an initiation into higher intelligence. What appeared as loneliness, abandonment, or even failure was a deeper, behind-the-scenes transformation. While everyone performed for the world, distracted by noise, opinions, and surface validation, you were being pulled away, stripped of shallowness to allow something sacred to rise. Not a breakdown, but a download. People assumed wasted time, falling off or disappearing. What they missed was your divine rewiring. You weren't hiding, but being hidden, because those called to carry higher knowledge require a cleared crowd, silenced noise, and a broken ego, not to destroy you, but to make room for the greater. The manipulable version of you had to be dismantled so the version hearing directly from source could come online. That quiet season was never empty, but sacredly full. You were in the presence of something too holy for spectators. That cave wasn't a prison, but a womb, And while others chased shallow success or fought for visibility, you learned the language of the unseen. You were being trained by silence, shaped by stillness, and instructed by a power that speaks not in noise but in knowing. Hence your transformation. Hence the confusing peace you now carry. You didn't just survive isolation but were transformed by it. What was meant to destroy you became the very place of your construction. Not punishment, but a divine classroom, a sacred initiation into intelligence, discernment, and power unteachable in public. Now you carry untraceable wisdom. They can't comprehend your knowledge or your detachment from what shakes others. Because you underwent something most avoid: divine isolation. And you didn't just undergo it, but grew through it, leaving that silence carrying the very voice of Source. 8th, your mind is wired to decode what others are trained to ignore. While most are conditioned to see only the obvious surface level and socially acceptable, you're attuned to unspoken deeper layers. You see meaning in overlooked moments. You don't just notice what's happening, but why, what's beneath it, and what it's communicating spiritually. You don't have a regular mind, but a decoding mechanism, not accidental, but designed. You were never meant to accept life at face value. That's why the news doesn't fool you. That's why polished words never distract from underlying energy. While the world is hypnotized by appearances and headlines, you're 5 layers deep, catching the symbolic, the hidden, and the embedded divine fingerprints. And explaining what you see often elicits confusion or skepticism. Because most have been trained to tune it all out, but you never could. You see signs, synchronicities, and repeated patterns, not from paranoia or overanalyzing, but because your mind knows the difference between chaos and divine design. You're not inventing it. You're picking it up. You're processing more than just facts. You're filtering energy, frequency, symbolism, and patterns carrying spiritual messages. Hence the drain of shallow conversations. Hence the lack of interest in superficial jobs or relationships. You were never meant to live in the shallows, but were born for depth. Your brain connects dots that weren't meant to stay disconnected. You're decoding life as a message from Source because to you that's exactly what it is. Others might call it overthinking, but their minds were trained to ignore what makes them powerful. Yours wasn't. Yours stayed open. That's why people come to you when things don't make sense, because they know you carry intelligence beyond logic. You don't just observe life, you interpret it in real time, making you a living oracle of truth. 9th, you inherit knowledge the system seeks to erase. You carry deliberately buried truths, buried by power structures built on distortion. You know things absent from textbook sermons or sanitized documentaries. Your wisdom bypasses filtered versions of history, religion, culture, and identity intentionally rewritten to control the masses. That's why your knowing feels so raw, disruptive, and hard for others to grasp. Because it originates from what's been hidden, not taught. Everything about the modern world is curated to disconnect people from Source, from whitewashed history to commercialized spirituality to language redefining truth. The system isn't built to educate, but to program. But you never fully absorbed the programming. You didn't swallow what they handed you. Something in you always felt the cracks. Something in you always knew this wasn't the full story, and you were right. Your soul predates colonization, religion, and empire. The knowledge you carry was passed through bloodlines, dreams, and direct divine encounters. It lives in your bones, your dreams, your instincts. You may lack perfect articulation, but the knowing is there, and when it speaks, it cuts through centuries of lies like a hot blade. That's why the system can't contain you. You don't play by its mental rules because you were never built for its mental cage. So if this resonated with you, if even a flicker of recognition ignited within, know that you're not alone. You're part of something bigger, a collective of awakened souls here to remember and reshape the world. Embrace your knowing, trust your inner compass, and don't be afraid to speak your truth even when it feels like no one else understands. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What resonated most with you? Do you have any questions or maybe a story of your own experience that you'd like to share? Leave a comment below and let's start a conversation. And if you found this helpful or inspiring, please subscribe so you don't miss future explorations into the deeper truths of existence. We're all in this together, and I'm excited to continue the journey with you. Journey with you. Journey with you. Journey with